the contractor that we went with, their follow-up wasn't necessarily any better, but whenever they were on site, they taught us things. They told us things that we didn't know. And so that my buying experience was better. Like, they didn't just hand over a quote. Like, I asked for a quote on certain things, and they're like, I don't know that you want to do that. I can give you a quote for that, but here's why. At every turn, they taught me something. And so that created trust.
What is up, everybody? Welcome to episode 54 of Sales Stories in Real Life. I'm your host, Alex Bruski, and this is the show where professional salespeople share their stories about memorable buying experiences. Today, we've got the one, the only, Krysten Conner. She is a sales strategist at User Gems. You can find her sharing knowledge, resources on LinkedIn all the time. Krysten, welcome to the show. And so glad that we finally got to do this. I heard you had an interesting buying experience when you were having some trouble with a new home. What the heck happened there?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me today. It's exciting to be here. I'm glad we get to do this, face-to-face stuff. It's been a minute since you and I have connected on LinkedIn. As we were talking, so we just moved from Austin to Dallas, and we bought this house that we were like, oh, great. With the house is 2 years old, we shouldn't have to do any work to it. And we got to the house, and literally within the first 24 hours, there were two major systems that were completely failing. And by the 10th day, there were four like major things that we needed to fix that the seller had just not told us about, or were trashed, or what have you. And so when you want to talk, as a salesperson, like, I was in a lot of pain, right? Like, I had a lot of pain, and I definitely had a compelling event. Like, we literally had huge tiles falling off of our fireplace because the contractor didn't do it right. And so, and we couldn't move anything in because the floors were destroyed. Like, major pain and major compelling events, right? Like, we had moved. I've got a kid that's getting ready to start school. Like, I was a dream buyer, right? Like, I have full buying authority. I don't need to bring in 7 people. Just, it's, just my husband and myself, and like, we're equal co-buyers. Like, I can sign right now, And so I'm like, wow, I'm going to make somebody's day. And so, but like, being just like our buyers and B2B, like, I had to do due diligence, right? Like, I can't take the first, quote that walks through the door, even though I want to, right? Because I'm in a lot of pain. And if we think about, I think sometimes as sellers, we think like, oh, well, this person is in pain. I have the thing that fixes their problem. They don't really need to. Why would you need to talk to anyone else? Like, you've already agreed I can solve your problem. And that would be true, right? Like, with every contractor that came to us, like, we chose them. And again, and also like our buyers, I did a lot of research online before I even contacted them, right? Like, if you dig into the stats a little bit, like 70% of buying decisions are made, especially in transactional sales, are made before they even talk to a salesperson, because they've done a lot of work online to try to decide, do I even want to have the hassle of talking to a salesperson, right? So I had done some homework. I had qualified, the people. And so I think that's the first thing, is like, just because we can solve someone's pain doesn't mean they're not going to look at competitors, just because I had great conversations with the salespeople. I liked almost every one of them. They're in sales, right? Like, they're likable people, or they wouldn't have stayed in sales. And so I was smiling to myself as I'm thinking about them putting notes in, like, great conversation, like, we had a great conversation, has pain, has compelling event, has timeline, has budget, like, agrees there's a problem, agrees that we can solve the problem. All, like, I hit all the boxes. But at the end, we were buying, and I probably met with 3 different contractors Probably got 3 different bids for each different problem. So I talked to 13 contractors. And what was very interesting to me, because like we're having to then as a, if we think about an executive buyer, like they are not just dealing with one problem, right? Skip Miller talks about executives being station masters and problems or projects being trains. No station master is managing just one train. So we are thinking about our solution all day long. That's the only thing we're thinking about. Versus this executive buyer is thinking about 4 to 10 things, and 4 of them are things that need to be fixed, and maybe one of them we can either solve all of it, but more likely a piece of it, right? So that's why it takes so long a lot of times for sales to happen, and that's why it takes so many touches, which actually goes to what I wanted to talk about, which is of the 13 contractors, 3 of them followed up with me even once. That means the vast majority talked to me, gave me a quote, and were of course eager whenever I was like, yeah, send the quote over. They're like, here's the DocuSign, right? And of course that's another buying behavior, right? Like I've asked for a quote. And so, on that end, like I was doing all the right things, but I didn't buy from 13 of them. I bought from, I only bought from 4. So then it made me think, okay, well, I wonder how much, because you and I have been in sales environments where it's just drilled into you, like follow up, follow up, follow up. And so I kind of assume like, well, everyone's following up, even bad follow up, like even poor follow up of like, hey, just checking in, which is, we should never just check in. But even that, only 3 of them. And 2 of the 3 of them followed up with me more than once. No one followed up more than 3 times, which is like in B2B, like we should never, I shouldn't say we would never. And so then I started really digging in, and I think I dug into Challenger data, and it was like 8% of reps follow up more than 3 times, but in touches in touches 6 through 15 is where things are closed, right? So if we are not following up more than once, we're really shooting ourselves in the foot, right? And then if we do bad follow-up, right, like just checking in, so like, okay, so that was the bad experience. I want to, again, like before I was an enterprise AE at places like Salesforce and Outreach and Tableau, I was a teacher. And so that's part of what I do on LinkedIn is teach, okay, here's something we all know we should be doing, or we're told we should be doing, but we get told this by sales managers who don't necessarily break things down for us. They might tell us follow up, follow up, follow up, but they don't necessarily say, okay, well, in this role, here's the best way to follow up with this person. And so, I think the best salespeople are buyer centric. They are trying to solve a buyer's problem, and therefore everything they do is buyer centric. And our follow-ups can be buyer centric. And here's how that looks. And it kind of follows like a Challenger, the idea of teach, right? Teach and tailor, and then that helps you take control of that sale. Because if you are teaching the buyer something, so let me tell you what that would have looked like in real life. We have concrete floors in the first floor of the house that we wanted to keep them. We like the modern look, we wanted to keep it, but they were ruined. But we don't know, I've never had a concrete floor, I don't know anything about fixing them or maintaining them. And so we were thinking, okay, well, do we want to keep concrete, do we want to do tile? And several of the contractors we met with had more than one solution, right? They could have done concrete or they could have done tile. And so we told them we're trying to decide. So if one of them had followed up with me and said, hey, Krysten, we spoke last week, you were considering, staying concrete versus tile to fix your floor. What some homeowners find helpful is knowing X, Y, and Z. And what many of them don't think about is, A, B, and C. which sometimes causes problems later on. And sometimes that can even cause, a fix that's necessary that costs 10x of what your original spend was. That would have been incredibly helpful. And they know that, like they have that between their ears, but they should have told me that. And also, if they had sent me that follow-up rather than saying just checking in, it would have kept them on my radar. It would have kept them top of mind, and it would have clearly differentiated them from anyone else who either was never following up or was just bumping this back to the top of the inbox. Right. And then so let's just say like that was their, first follow-up. Another follow-up would be like, hey, Krysten, we spoke 2 weeks ago, you were considering tile versus concrete. And that sounded like that was priority, like getting the floors done was priority number one, because you really can't do any other work to your house until the floor is done. And it has to be really frustrating still living out of boxes. Here's the name of a person where we were able to quickly solve the same problem. And I thought it might be helpful for you to have their contact information, right? That's a different kind of follow-up, because, and that could be in B2B. It could be a customer reference story. Ideally, it would be if it's an enterprise sale, I would suggest it being like direct contact information, because executives want to talk to other executives who buy it. But like understanding that the problem has been solved well for someone else lowers risk, right? Because it's much more risky for me to buy than it is for them to sell. They're not going to get fired probably for not making one sale, but if I'm going to spend once, and if that initiative fails, right? If those concrete floors are terrible, if the implementation gets screwed up, I have to live with that every day forever, right? So like there's a lot of parallels with B2B going on. So if you're the kind of seller that wants to add value, and we're thinking, if your manager says, well, add value with all this, with every follow-up, God bless the managers that say that. Great. It's great teaching, but freaking tell us how to do that, right? Give your reps the way to do that. And so in any B2B environment, some of the things you can do to go look at to figure out, okay, well, how do I find these resources? How do I find these insights to give to people? Look at places like Harvard Business Review. Look at the publications that are put out by McKinsey, that are by Forbes. Those are well-respected sources. They're not your marketing department, right? Like it's insights coming from someone else, so it's more trustworthy. They have no skin in anyone buying from you. Also look at like industry-specific newsletters, podcasts, magazines, where we're speaking the language of your buyer. And you can also look at, like, you're looking for statistics on things to help quantify a problem. Sometimes you can look at government or census stats about the problems your buyers have. So there's lots of different ways. Those are things that I have done myself in order to add value for different buyers in different ways. The last thing I'll say is that really no effort there is going to be wasted, because even if someone sends me an insight that I already kind of knew, it's a reinforcement, because that's not necessarily top of mind. And again, it separates them from everyone else who just sent me something about just checking in, right? So I think I said a lot of things. There's a lot of lessons that could be learned, but you're right. As a seller, when we buy, we have all of these things in mind, right? Like, and this experience just like blew my mind as far as what happened versus what should have happened.
No, that was excellent. And this is why I love doing the show so much, candidly, is like when you think about everything and just flip the perspective on its head and think about it as a buyer, like you sell so much better, right? You stop just checking in, right? You stop bubbling to the top of people's inboxes. And I think you made a really great point on the tail end of your statement, is like, even if you tell them something that they already knew, number one, it's way better than bubbling to the top of their inbox or asking any thoughts or any like that. But even more importantly, it reinforces the idea to begin with. And third, it shows that you know what the heck you're talking about, right? Like I'll make a sports example here, right? Like if you said like, hey, I know your favorite team is the Yankees, right? And I saw the Yankees just did this. And even if I knew that already, I would feel some commonality, right? Like it wouldn't be like, oh, I need my latest and greatest news from you all the time, but like you're creating commonality in an area that that person really cares about. So I really, really like this topic. Let's continue going down this thread. We've not had an episode where we like really dug into follow up specifically. So let's say we've got sellers that are listening to the show and they want to add value in their touches, right? They know they have the desire to do so, but maybe they just don't have the know-how. I guess let's maybe start from the top of like, what exactly does that mean, right? Like what exactly is a value added touch and how can someone do that in their role, right? We're all selling different things. How can someone do a value add touch dependent on their industry?
Yeah, I think I love the premise of this show about of thinking of like what happens when sellers become buyers, because one of my friends, Nate Nasrallah, what he talks about is he's like, we learn more from studying buyers than we do from studying sellers, right? Like these are the people who are doing repeatedly what we're trying to get them to do. So let's learn from the way that they've already done it. So I think it's a really smart way to approach it. And adding value can mean a lot of different things. Sometimes it means teaching someone something that they didn't know. In the case, it can be many times there are, many times there's multiple ways to solve a problem. Sometimes you are even selling two products that may solve similar things. And that complexity, whether it's two things you sell or the same thing but sold by 4 different suppliers, that's complex complexity slows down deals because people are thinking, how do I decide between these things? So any information that you give them that helps them make a decision is going to speed up your deal, right? And it's also you're also giving them, that's a value add. They need a way to distinguish it. What that doesn't mean is a feature or function of your product by itself. Now, the only legit way to mention a feature or a function as a differentiator is if it creates a different impact for the buyer, right? Like if it creates a different business outcome. So you might say like, I'm trying to think of like a way to quantify that. So it's like if someone was helping me decide between tile and concrete, they might say like, hey, these two things at the beginning costs, like tile costs more and concrete is more cost effective if you're thinking about like a short-term, fix. But what you might think about is concrete floors are very dusty and you'll have to clean them a lot. And our research shows that in this market, buyers are looking for like very low maintenance things, and tile is like highly, favored. And so like if you're thinking about like resale value, if you don't think you're going to be in the house very long, you might want to, weigh that a little more heavily. Like that's information I didn't have. Right. And so like, or things I may not have thought about and be like, oh, that, that is a good point. I think some of the best places to just low-hanging fruit on figuring those things out is looking at the customer stories that your marketing team has published, right? Because in that, there's a buyer who's being interviewed about a problem and a pain that they had. And generally, it's a fairly lengthy, either 3 to 5 minute video or a piece that's going to take you 10 minutes to read, where there's multiple quotes that talking about like the problem they solved. I've done this. That's the first place I go when I start something new or I'm looking for value adds, is like, I want to understand what are their peers saying about, these are problems. These are things we were worried about. This held us back from making a decision. So you can look at your own customer stories to begin with. And then you can, like I said, you can also look at, I always rate things outside of our marketing department as higher value because there's no conflict of interest, right? If Harvard is saying something, if McKinsey is saying something, if Forbes or Inc. magazine is saying something, or LinkedIn publishes research, nobody's going to argue with that, right? It doesn't create friction. They're not as skeptical of that as they would be if I would have been like, well, our customers find, well, of course they do. They're your customers.
Well, that's really well said, because I think you said it earlier, is like those sources aren't incentivized for people to go to you. So I think that's a really good example with like the concrete and the tile, and like, hey, here are some things that people notice with concrete. Here are some things that people notice with tile. And just also shouting out Nate again. He says this also, another place I know that's kind of good to find some of that stuff is that person who you're prospecting into, if they have job listings up, right? Like they're kind of saying in their own words, like what they're looking for, what are initiatives. So I think really the blanketed takeaway is like, use your customers' words in your outreach. Right? Like
absolutely.
No words are better than your customers' words.
Absolutely.
So important question for you. We got a lot of B2B sellers that are listening to the show. You gave us a lot of tips that are extremely relevant to B2B. If folks that are listening could take away one thing from this episode, Krysten, what would that one big takeaway be?
Follow-up alone differentiates you. Good follow-up puts you in the top 1%. Right? Like the bad news is that people are doing a dismal job of The good news is it's very easy to stand out and look different than that, right? And so like, the research says that most people see almost all solutions as being equal, right? There's very few people that have no peer in an industry. And so many times what makes the difference is the buying experience. And as sellers, we are a huge part of that buying experience. And if our communication helps them know that we are thinking about it from their perspective, that we want to help them in a way that is not blatantly about our solution, but is about their impact, things they care about, that will come through. And even if I had somebody, actually the contractor that we went with, their follow-up wasn't necessarily any better, but whenever they were on site, they taught us things. They told us things that we didn't know. And so that my buying experience was better. Like they didn't just hand over a quote. Like I asked for a quote on certain things and they're like, I don't know that you want to do that. I can give you a quote for that, but here's why. At every turn, they taught me something. And so that created trust, right? And so I would much rather deal with them than someone who, I asked for a quote, you spat me back a quote 5 minutes later. But the better buying experience is someone who's focused enough on me to help me think through something.
Outstanding. I don't even want to put anything on the top of that, because that was like perfect as is. The analogy that I like to use is like, you want to shoot a bullseye, right? Like you want to like aim and scope, like archery, if you will. And like really when you send out a proposal, like you want to send out a proposal knowing that it's going to get signed. Not like, hey, can I get a proposal? Yeah, sure. Here you go. It's not like newspapers you're passing out on the corner. I completely agree. Krysten, this has been an absolute blast. Seriously, I'm so glad that we got to do this. I know that you're working on a bunch. Why don't you plug away with the audience? We're excited to hear about it.
Well, I wouldn't be worth my salt if I focused on what I was doing versus like what people are feeling, right? Whenever I made a big career leap from teaching to running a small business to then tech sales. And whenever I did that, my first year, I thought I might die of all the things I didn't know. I had never used Salesforce. I didn't know what ACV meant, all these things. And so I was behind the curve and I had to learn a lot. And so what I hope to do, and people can easily find me on LinkedIn, and what I hope to do both on LinkedIn and then with any resources that I have, there's a number of free resources on my website, which you can find on LinkedIn, just KrystenConner.com. Those resources are meant to help people that are in that same position, right? There were a lot of people that helped me. And so because of my teaching background, along the way, I've just compiled the things that I've learned that I wish I knew as an early seller, or things I needed, crucial things I needed to be reminded of, even as a tenured seller. And I just try to write them down and make it easy for people to implement them. Not just high level concepts, but this is what this sounds like in this situation. This is what, this is what we need to do. So if folks are in a situation where, they're not maybe getting as much training or coaching from a manager or a leader or a mentor, working in a small company that doesn't have any enablement, that lots of times we're in those scenarios. That's what I hope to help with.
That's amazing. Folks, make sure you go check out Krysten's website. That's spelled Krysten space CONNER. Krysten, this has been an absolute blast. I am not surprised that you made the jump from a teacher to now ultimately being in tech sales. You have that kind of teacher way of speaking. So thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us all. Sales Stories in Real Life, fam. We will see you next week. Cheers.